We're excited today to be discussing a topic I think is going to be germane to everybody, if not now, definitely in the coming future. And our guest speaker, I'd like to introduce her. Her name is Nicole Harrell, and she is a member of Kaufman and Canoles law firm, which her office is located in Norfolk. She is the chair in the Data Privacy and Security Practice Group. Nicole regularly assists clients with cyber preparedness and breach response. Her data privacy and security practice includes preparation of incident response plans and counseling clients on preparing for a cyber incident. Nicole helps clients understand their risk and plan accordingly. Nicole's intellectual property practice includes federal and state trade registrations, copyright registrations, and assignment, negotiation of software development and licensing agreements, and licensing acquisitions, and general contract negotiation. She has experience in negotiating supply and distribution agreements as well. And her bio is very lengthy. She's very much involved in our state, working with Virginia Alcohol Beverage Control, as well as she represents franchises in review of franchise disclosure documents, negotiation of franchise agreements, and termination of franchise agreements and relationships. So we are excited to have Nicole with us this morning. Her breadth of experience is very deep, and we're excited to hear the information she has to share with us. So Nicole, I'm going to turn this over to you and let you start with your presentation.
Great, thank you very much for being here, and good morning, everyone. We will jump right in. We can cover quite a bit of information in the short time that we have together this morning. As Raymond indicated, part of my practice focuses on data privacy and security. There's not a day that goes by right now that you don't open your computer, or for those of you that still get the newspaper and read that, open the newspaper and see something in there along these lines. Whether you know, the big headlines are generally going to be the Yahoo type data breaches, or for many of you that remember sort of the Home Depot size type data breaches. But I can assure you that they sort of run the gamut of businesses, and while extraordinarily large businesses can certainly be the focus of sort of data and security attacks and sort of resulting breaches from those incidents, this affects businesses of all size and scale. The larger businesses often tend to be a little bit more prepared, but the purpose, simply because they have a lot more dollars to throw sort of at the issue and their IT systems and the like, but the purpose of today is to give you sort of in the smaller business community some tips and hopefully some takeaways that you can use in your own businesses, because we are seeing a significant number of small businesses that are falling victim to data breaches on a very regular basis. On a smaller scale, it's often difficult to recover from that, and so hopefully this will give you a little bit of information that you can use in your sort of daily business life. So I will. All right. There are any number of threats of, you know, looming in the not too distant future on a daily basis. The types of threats are generally evolving, and that's because while you and I are sitting in our offices attempting to go about our daily lives and run our businesses, there's someone sitting behind a computer that is attempting to attack your business. And as much as we have sort of brilliant minds, you know, here in the U.S. acting on our behalf to try to stop these sorts of things. There are equally as brilliant minds on the other side of the table. And so while, some think that the criminal actors in these events can sometimes be one step ahead because they know what is being used to combat their actions. So they are always looking to change what they're doing. So it's certainly not a static environment. And if you look at it, sort of the types of ransomware, for example, have even evolved. While you can go and buy Windows and run a Windows system for your office or your business on your computers, there is also basically a ransomware as a service type, almost an off-the-shelf product that you can buy as well and use that sort of to attack other businesses. So you can, it's not just, it's not limited anymore. And unfortunately, they're making it sort of easier for other people to do this. So you see a lot of private actors. Those groups are readily in the news. Probably more of what we see is along the private actor segment. But that doesn't mean there's state actors are not sort of working as well. And I think we equally see that in the news, just on a very different level. Again, most of what we're dealing with is private actors, unless you happen to have a business that works in government contracting and the like. And in that case, depending on sort of what you're doing, you may be more susceptible to sort of the next step up, which is state actors attempting to get information on the government contracts that you might be working on or other information in your systems. For example, there are any number of, just look out your windows around here, there are any number of sort of shipbuilding and military installations abound in our region. And so those types of businesses are more likely to be targeted by particular state actors, not to the exclusion of sort of private actors, but the sensitivity of the information they hold is sort of at a very different level. So what are various types of issues that you may face? I mentioned ransomware, and I think right now, ransomware is probably the most prevalent. We see it on a very regular basis. It is sort of very easy, as I mentioned. There's like an off-the-shelf product right now for ransomware that shows several of them. So it's an easy to execute attack for sort of criminal actors. I do always mention W-2 scams. We're at the end of, or at least approaching the end of 2021. So all of you will, in the beginning of January, begin preparing your W-2s for your employees. I cannot emphasize enough sort of to watch the email traffic that you get, in January, February, March. We've even seen it happen in the April timeframe. Watching, is someone asking for a copy of your W-2 file so they can do a salary review, for example, of employees? If that happens, red flags should go up. For example, there's really no reason that a person down the hall from you, or if you're not remote, someone that you work with on a regular basis would be asking you for a file of your W-2s. Pick up the phone and have a discussion about it. So if you get that, again, sort of be alert, because if you send that file out, then you are going to have to report to all of your employees, presumably get some sort of protection in place for them. At least in Virginia now, those types of issues have to be reported to the Attorney General as well. It goes much broader than that. So let's say, for example, you had 2 employees that have recently left. They're then your former employees, but one's moved to North Carolina and one's moved to California. You are then looking at having to comply with the requirements for notification in California and the requirements for notification in North Carolina, because both of those individuals reside in other states. So when you look at the W-2 scam, I think one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is the breadth at which you may have to sort of dive in, and the various state laws that may be implicated. I can tell you I've had done one not that long ago where the company was absolutely positive that everyone lived in Virginia. And that was certainly not the case, and we ended up having to deal with 17 different state laws. So it can spread really quickly. BEC is what we refer to business email compromise. This is one particularly for small businesses, I think, that is also sort of high on the list here in terms of making sure you're recognizing what potentially happens. And BEC fraud is where someone essentially gets into your system. They impersonate the head of the company or someone who's in charge of making sure various types of payments are authorized and the like. They send an email which looks like it is from that individual to the person who's responsible for writing the checks and initiating wire transfers and the like for your vendors. It says wire X number of dollars to this particular vendor. Here's their wiring instructions or their payment information. This is recently changed. Make note of it for the file. We've seen companies wire out very small amounts. We've seen companies wire out very large amounts. In one instance, we had a company wire out over $2.5 million to a vendor to a false account. There are not a lot of businesses that can take that type of hit. There is very little recourse, if any at all, that you will have against your bank when something like that happens, because the bank is going to look at you and say, we were following your payment instructions. So there's not a lot that can be done there. And again, like I said, there's a lot of companies that can't take that level of hit without sort of getting those funds back. Real estate transaction fraud is another one that we have seen rise significantly. It may not necessarily come into play for most of you here. However, I mention it because many of us buy and are moving at any given time. You're in the process of selling your home and moving to a new home. It's the same concept here that I just sort of discussed with business email compromise, and that is you are getting ready to close. You've got to wire funds to a certain account. Someone intervenes, generally at your title company level is where that often happens, and the funds that you were going to put as the down payment on your new home are wired to an account that is obviously quickly drained, and those funds are then gone. We've seen a lot of that. It is prevalent in all sizes of real estate transactions. A couple years ago, there was actually a New York State Supreme Court justice who fell victim to this real estate transaction fraud to the tune of over $1 million. So it's certainly out there. It's not limited to residential. You see it on the commercial side of real estate as well. Network system failure and a hacker that is in your system. A lot of times this type of threat is you've got software that you're using for your network, and you've not patched it. Any number of very large breaches that you have seen over the past couple of years have been a result of this. One of the most prevalent ones was a couple of years ago when the entire Maersk, which is a shipping line, their systems were impacted. You can imagine sort of the logistical nightmare that caused when you're talking about massive container ships and a transportation and logistics company, shipping company as large as Maersk is. It also took down the Australian Airlines booking system for multiple days. So, and that is really because of notification came out. If you have this type of software, here are the patches. They did not patch their systems accordingly. And then there's a huge vulnerability, because what happens when Microsoft, or for that matter, any of the other large software companies send out a notice saying, this is your patch, you need to install it, is then basically a flag to criminal actors that, okay, for people that don't fix this, we now have a way to get into their systems. So it's really important if you are running various types of software that you pay attention to those fixes and you apply whatever patches or updates that are issued. Most software will have sort of a daily, or not daily, but a regular patch system. For example, Microsoft used to always have a patch Tuesday. I'm not sure if it's still on Tuesday, but any of the large software companies, generally it's very well known sort of when they're going to do this. Denial of service attacks are something that still happen, but I don't see that quite as much. That is essentially when someone bombards your system and ultimately just sort of overwhelms it, and you're not able to continue with the normal traffic in and out of your network and your system. Phishing, and that's something that really goes with any of the number of other things that we have here. That's a primary way for someone to get into your system. It is here's the free Chick-fil-A coupon, click here to redeem your coupon. You've done that. You've then opened and exposed your network and your system to someone who is not going to give you a Chick-fil-A coupon, and whatever you do get is going to cost far more than the sandwich that you could have otherwise purchased. So be very careful. Make sure your employees are watching for these types of phishing emails. I'll talk a little bit more about it now, but I'll mention it now. Your employees are your front line when it comes to cybersecurity. You'll have any number of other things that you may have put into place, but training your employees and reminding them of the importance of thinking about something before they click on it. Really looking at an email, because a lot of times there are so many errors in an email. If you just look at the address of the sender, that sometimes is the biggest indication of a fraudulent email, because it may look like it is coming, for example, from Nicole Harrell, but it is not going to be my my username at Kaufman.com. It may say something like Kaufman.us or something of that nature. So really sort of paying attention to those and watching what's in the email, the text of the email, how it's written, and the like. So have a couple of slides here, and I won't spend a lot of time on them. They're from various Ponymon reports over the last couple of years to give you an example of sort of the source of various attacks. You can see here human error is still really big. I mean, obviously the malicious attack is the majority of what you're happening here, but almost 25% of the attacks that we're seeing sort of surveyed in this report were a result of human error, and that's something that I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. Most employees don't go to work today saying, "Hey, I'm going to click on that email and tank my company." So it is really an error. I don't think most employees have that sort of malicious intent. Now, that's not to say some of those cases haven't arisen, but the majority of what we're talking about, it is not sort of the disgruntled employee that has sort of bad intention with respect to that. The point of this slide here is that cyber and data security breaches are extraordinarily expensive. They are not going to get any cheaper. We have seen companies spend thousands and thousands of dollars in order to recover from one of these. For example, we had a very small business that had extraordinarily sensitive information. As a result of the incident, they had to completely rebuild their entire computer network system, and there were not that many employees, but they lost everything. They lost all of their servers. They had to have new workstations, everything to the tune of over $70,000. That was just their cost to recover their network systems alone. That did not include the amount that they spent on forensics. That did not include the amount that they spent on attorney's fees. This particular company did not have cyber insurance, so everything they paid was completely out of pocket. Again, there are not a lot of small businesses that, when you're looking at spending, you know, $200,000+, that was not a line item in your budget for the year. There's not a lot of companies that can withstand that type of cost. One of the other sort of important pieces here is if you do have someone in your system, you can see the average time to identify and contain is 280 days. That's a lot of time. What often happens is if you have someone sort of in there lurking around, what they will be sitting there waiting. So they're going to be in there before they ever make themselves known. And then once that happens and you're aware of the breach, you've got to figure out what they have done, what information may have been accessed, what information you may have to restore and recover, and sort of make sure that there's no further, you have to sort of mitigate the damage there, make sure there's no further damage to your business, and then move on. That's a long period of time. I can tell you the most of the businesses that we have worked with do not anticipate the amount of time the sort of breach response process can actually take. So again, I'm not going to go through all the information on this slide, but the point of this is that small businesses are most definitely targets. You've probably been a target and not known about it yet. You've probably heard when it comes to data breaches, it's not if, but when. Most companies will experience some sort of breach at some point in time, whether that's sort of a W-2 issue or whether it is a ransomware attack. I will say, you know, even and particularly with W-2, I have seen companies who fall victim to that sort of, please send me a file of all of your W-2 records so I can do a salary survey, you know, from the president of the company. I have seen companies fall victim to that multiple years in a row. Again, a lot of that is going to be a training issue with respect to your employees. You know what? For this slide, there's a lot of information here. One of the things I think that you have seen, and it's gone from one end of the spectrum to another, are password practices and what you do. You would be surprised at the number of people, I don't actually have the statistic here, but you'd be surprised at the number of people who even work in IT departments that use the same password across multiple accounts, from their work accounts to the account that they have when they buy their pants at Gap or Old Navy or wherever it is they, sort of buy clothes, using that same password for all of their business purposes, as well as for their personal reasons. Passwords, it's not hard really to crack a password if you've got someone who does that on a regular basis. They can generally do it pretty quickly. It used to be that you were told to have a password, that no one could, that was kind of very complicated, that no one could replicate. What sort of the backlash of that was no one could remember what their passwords were. So people sort of gradually went back and had something they can remember and then started using that across multiple platforms. Well, if that's what you do, then not only do I have access into your, let's say, your email system through your getting into your network, that password, but if you're using that for your bank account, then I can probably pretty easily figure out where you bank and go in and move some funds around through your bank. So be mindful of that. The password practices now are to have some sort of phrase. You've seen it even when you go various sites now, they require like a capital, at least a capital letter, a number, and some type of symbol. Those are generally good practices to have. Almost every site now has something where if you don't remember it, it'll issue you a password reset, and oftentimes there is two-factor authentication when you do that. So they send you something, and then you'll be asked if you want a text message sent to your phone to make sure you're asking for that particular information. You're asking for the password change. So I would encourage you to remind your employees and even sort of for your own purposes to make sure you use good password practices. It's okay if you don't remember it. There's generally an easy reset with respect to that. I get asked quite a bit, are there any good password vaults like apps and the like that you can use? There are any number of ones that are out there. A couple of them have had their own data breaches. So, but oftentimes, obviously that you lose a little consumer confidence with respect to that, but there's quite a few on the market, and many of them are very good. So if that is an option for you, you can't remember it, I would say use one of those apps. Don't have the sticky note sitting on your computer or in the pad of paper that you sit by your computer. Don't write all your passwords there. And I'm laughing about that, but you'd be surprised at how often we actually see that. So here again, you can see the potential cost of data breaches and the interruption. It's one thing, sort of the actual monetary cost, but I can tell you it is extraordinarily disruptive for your company to go through this process, even if it is ransomware and let's say you've got a plan in place, you've set all the precautions, you're able to sort of come back and up and running pretty quickly because you have a full backup of your data. It is still disruptive even when that happens. We had a business very recently who had a backup of their data that was the day before they got hit with ransomware. Their IT company was great in helping them get set up and running again, but I can tell you it took about 4 or 5 days, complete days of productivity out of their employees, simply because it takes that time to figure it out. Everyone has to sort of stop. You can't be on your systems or networks. The network may be shut down. And then your IT sort of team has to come back in there and get you back up and running. So even if you sort of have the best laid plans there, it's still costly, not just from a monetary perspective, but also from the standpoint of the disruption to your operations. And most people want to get back up and running as quickly as possible. So a couple of tips, things for you to take away. I cannot emphasize enough on training for your employees, looking for training them on phishing emails and what to look for. We generally have employees that want the company to succeed, because if the company succeeds, they maintain their job. They're still earning wages. A lot of people actually like where they work, and so they want to be there. So training them to sort of have some sort of ownership with respect to security, I think, is extraordinarily important. I've had a couple people say, well, I don't want to raise my hand and ask the question. And I think particularly when it comes to data privacy and security, that we need to shift from that focus, and we need to encourage employees to stop and say, if you have a question or you think something is wrong here, it just doesn't seem right, stop and ask. Walk down the hall, pick up the phone, ask a colleague, ask your supervisor. If you have an IT person within your business, ask your IT person. Now, many of you here probably wear all the hats, where you might be the supervisor and the IT person and the person that they're going to call, and that's fine. I can understand that's a lot of additional parts of your plate that you've got sort of to take care of, but you want your employees to stop and ask those questions, because really clicking on the wrong email can be absolutely detrimental. So encouraging them to ask questions if they see something, sort of the old see something, say something, that you probably heard a lot when you were, at least in my household, when I was growing up. So do that, follow sort of that same principle here, is encourage them to ask questions. Make sure you have the security out there in front of them on a daily basis. Many companies will have sort of like an internal newsletter that they may send around. Put a tip in there. You can find any number of tips available on the internet, sort of for good security practices that your employees can sort of start to work into their daily habits of working. Protect your information, your computers, and your networks. If you're using software and there are patches that need to be made, make sure you are installing those patches. Make sure you're doing that on a regular basis, because when like Microsoft notifies that a patch is coming out and it is available, it actually describes what the vulnerability is, and it tells people what vulnerability is being fixed as a result of the patch. So, the bad actors then know exactly exactly sort of where to go if you don't fix that vulnerability and apply that patch. Make sure you have some sort of firewall in place. It's generally a helpful practice. It's a good practice to have. If you allow your employees to use their mobile devices, their personal mobile devices for work purposes, make sure you have a plan in place. And it doesn't have to be an elaborate plan, but you need to make sure your employees are employing some basic level of security with respect to that. Because if, for example, I can use my mobile device and access all of my work email, that's a vulnerability in and of itself right there. A lot of companies now will have the ability, if a mobile device is lost, there is a remote wipe option, which then can sort of wipe everything. The company can wipe everything on that device. One of the things that employees don't particularly like about mobile device plans is that, essentially anything that is on the phone is subject to the employer looking at that if there is an issue, and sort of lost to a certain extent. So if I have to wipe the device, does that mean I'm wiping all of the photos or personal contacts that may be on that phone? So A lot of that is just making sure you've got you're informing your employees of your policies with respect to that. That can be done through your employee handbooks and the like if you have those. Backing up your data on a regular basis. Another one of these that I cannot emphasize enough, particularly in the ransomware world that we live in now. And what happens oftentimes with ransomware has really evolved. When we first started seeing ransomware many years ago, we had sort of sounds odd to say this, but very respectful criminals. And they said, okay, we've got your data. If you pay us, 15 Bitcoins, we will release your data to you. They really relied, again, it's odd to say this, they really relied on their reputation of saying, we're going to release this if you pay us the money. So a lot of people paid and they got their data back and they went along, those businesses sort of went along their way. What we've seen now is company or criminal actors that will say, okay, pay the Bitcoin and we'll give you your data back. Either they don't get the data back or the data is completely corrupted and cannot be used. That is when it is absolutely critical that you have a good backup of your data. We've seen companies lose 20 years worth of data simply because they didn't have it backed up ever. That is not the position that you want to be in. So make sure that you are backing up your data on a regular basis, and that you can actually use that sort of backup if and when you need it to do so. Have physical access or control the physical access to your computers. This is really simple. If you've got a couple of computers in your office, making sure that it times out after a certain period of time. I realize that you may have disgruntled employees that don't want to have to deal with logging back in if the timeout is set for 10 minutes or 15 minutes or something of that nature. But quite frankly, it's actually it's an easy sort of solution here to implement. Does it cause you to have to log back in? Yes, but with think about the number of people potentially in and out of your business and in and out of your office on a daily basis. This is a really sort of easy one to control. Secure your Wi-Fi networks. Do you allow, if you have visitors that physically come into your office or your place of business, do you allow them to get on your Wi-Fi network? If you do have visitors that come in, consider having a separate network, sort of a visitor network that they have to get on. A lot of businesses will have that if they've got a lot of visitors in and out. Most people will tell you, and I would have to agree, some of like the worst places to access other Wi-Fi. Something like a coffee shop is probably not going to be the most secure place if you decide to leave your office and work elsewhere for a short period of time. Be very mindful when you log on to other Wi-Fi networks that they are not likely to be secure. And if it is a public-based network where anyone can log on, there's not a lot of warm and fuzziness that can be offered there with respect to security. If you are a business that accepts credit cards, and most businesses do now, make sure you're using sort of good practices with respect to payment cards. If you're accepting cards, you're likely required to be PCI compliant. Many of you may use third-party vendors to handle all of your credit card processing. That is certainly fine, but what you want to do is make sure your vendors are compliant in that regard. I think people use vendors for that more often than not. But so that when it comes to sort of payment cards, it is really making sure your vendor is going to be compliant. You have to sign an agreement with your vendor, probably for processing payment cards. You may not be able to negotiate that contract depending on the size of your vendor. And we often see that, but at least understand what the risks are if that is the case, because there are ways to mitigate that risk. So if you're working with an extraordinarily large payment card processor and it's sort of, here's the contract, this is what we're going to require you to sign, it's non-negotiable. Is there insurance that you can put into place that can sort of backstop here if there are any data breaches? Limit employee access to data and information. Not everyone in your business needs to have access to every bit of information that you hold. For example, you have an HR employee. That person obviously needs access. They need access to all the employee information so they can facilitate running payroll and the like. But someone who works in the office sitting next to that person, or someone sort of who's on the front line of your business, for example, if you're in a retail business, does not need access to that level, that sort of employee data. Make sure that to the extent you have varying types of data and employees with varying responsibilities and obligations, that the data that they can access that you hold is really limited to what they need. There are very few instances where you'll have someone who needs access to absolutely everything that you have. Now that does happen, but again, that's going to be few and far between. If you have an IT individual who works with your in your business, now they're going to have a level of access that is going to be quite different. But make sure you have a policy in place, for example, as to what happens when that particular employee departs your company. You need that type of policy in any event. As employees leave a company, because what you do want to do is make sure that their access to your systems are promptly terminated, so they don't cause havoc once they are gone. Very recently, I saw an instance where an employee left a company. The former employee at that point in time wanted to see if he could still access his former employee's records, and sure enough, he logged right in from his computer, took a significant amount of very sensitive data, and left an email that said, "Hey, you didn't terminate my access. This is what I was able to get." That's what you don't want to sort of be in that situation, because then as the employer, you have an unauthorized access to data issue, which you very likely have to disclose. Again, finally, and we've talked a little bit about this, is have a password policy. You may require employees who have access to your system to change their password, let's say maybe every 3 months. That's certainly a good policy to have. You may have a requirement that you implement that it has a certain number of characters and uses very special characters and the like. Again, a good policy to have, and making sure sort of people are following that. Now, you can't actually, you won't know whether your employees are using the same password across multiple platforms, but at least requiring them to change the password every so often is a good practice to have. And if they forget it, that's fine. You'll have a mechanism in place where they can sort of reset a password. Okay, so vendor management, and we touched a little bit on this on the last slide. On the last slide is sort of making sure you know who your vendors are, what access do they have, what information do they hold, Do they have the ability to access your systems such that they could potentially produce or modify your data? What's the sensitivity level of the data that they have the ability to access? So understanding all of this helps you when it comes to contracting with that vendor as to what additional precautions or provisions that you need to put in place in your contract with the vendor. And does your vendor have that? I mean, if you're dealing with a vendor that is required to be PCI compliant, are they getting the proper audits that need to be done, every so often? What insurance do they have? Is that insurance going to name you as an additional insured on that policy? And again, it can be dependent on sort of what level of data and what type of data the vendor has the ability to access and what they're doing with respect to that data. This is one that I get asked about a lot. The million-dollar question when it comes to cyber insurance is, what's the right amount of coverage? And that's obviously an extraordinarily difficult question to ask. It's really important if you're thinking about insurance, if you don't already have it, or if you're considering additional insurance, making sure that you're talking to a broker that's got some experience in working with cyber insurance and cyber coverages. The policies are often sort of based on your revenues. If you have revenues at the smaller end of the scale, they may be more off-the-shelf type of policies, which are certainly fine and are generally better than nothing. Most of the policies that I have seen, even the ones for very small companies, have some basic protections in there when it comes to ransomware, W2, business email compromise, and those sorts of things. That's what you want. If you have a much larger company, the policies obviously are going to be quite different and often can be more expensive. And again, sometimes the pricing is based off on revenue. So there are certainly differences in the policies. It's really important to remember that cyber is typically excluded from the other types of policies that you may already have. And so it's not just about sort of, I need a cyber policy. It's looking to a certain extent at your other policies to see, really to confirm the fact that they're going to be excluded and that you need to obtain additional coverage as well. Now, there are some instances where certain types of breaches could potentially fall under one of your other policies, but for the most part, they are going to be under a separate cyber policy altogether. So I've given you a little bit of information about here, about the types of coverage. There are generally two types of coverage when we're talking about cyber: first party and third party. What you want to really look for here, is the policy going to cover sort of the forensic investigation? Is the policy going to cover your legal costs? What's the deductible for that policy? Hopefully you don't need to rely on sort of the public relations piece of it, but oftentimes, particularly for large breaches, they will have an amount that will cover if you've got to have someone sort of help you navigate you through that process. One of the things I'll tell you about policies is they will generally force you to use an appointed panel counsel. So if any of you have had employment-related claims under your existing insurance policies, you may have had a local attorney help you with your lease, but your policy, when it comes to an employment type of claim, is going to force you to use an attorney whom you may not know, that quite frankly may not even be located here in Virginia, and they're what we sort of call panel counsel. Cyber policies are going in that same direction. So you have the option to attempt to, a lot of times, get the insurance company to name counsel in there. They are going to want to make sure that that person has some sort of experience. But if you don't do that, you're going to be pushed to panel counsel, and there are some very large firms around the country that sort of are serving in that capacity now when it comes to sort of working through data breaches and the like. The last thing that I have here, and I will, I'm not going to run through all of these slides here, but just to give you a little bit of information on the new Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act that was signed in March of this year. It goes into effect January 2023. There is currently a working group that is developing guidelines for implementation on the new Data Protection Act. The Data Protection Act is sort of loosely modeled off of GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union. GDPR was then used as a model for the California Consumer Privacy Act. Virginia sort of then looked at both of those, GDPR as well as California, and we have the Consumer Data Protection Act here in Virginia now. So some of you, depending on the size of your business, may not be covered, but it is going to be a very specific sort of analysis and look at that. You know, do you process at least the data of at least 100,000 consumers, or do you process the data of 25,000 consumers and derive 50% of your gross revenue from the sale of personal data? Most likely, particularly on the last one, most businesses are not. As you can see, that last one is really aimed at companies that sort of are buying, selling data as a sort of core part of their business. For example, mailing lists and the like. So, you know, between now and January of 2023, sort of companies will have to take a look at this and see if the new Virginia regulation will apply. There are some exemptions which could be here important. You can see those listed here: financial institutions, if you're covered by HIPAA, if you're a nonprofit, higher education, government entities. Most of you are not likely to fall into those exemptions. So you'll, again, need to sort of take a closer look. If the law does apply, these are the general consumer rights that it affords Virginia residents. So access essentially means that someone can go in and have a right to access the data about them that you are holding. Portability means if I want to take it with me, I can ask you to transfer that data and to another business and take it there. Correction, obviously, if I think something is wrong, I should have the ability to correct the data about me that you're holding. Deletion is what you often hear as the right to be forgotten. So if I don't want you to have my data anymore, I can ask you to essentially forget me. And then sort of an opt-out, which is dealing sort of with whether or not you can continue sort of to contact that individual. So those consumer rights are very similar to, again, what we've seen in the European Union with respect to the GDPR, as well as California. I will say that the Virginia law, I think, is a little bit more a little bit more business friendly than California, but there's still sort of be a lot of work to do to make sure if you do have to comply that you get that sort of done before January 1 of 2023, and make sure your systems and your policies and the like are in place for compliance. So there are some potential monetary damages for violations. No private right of action, which for a lot of businesses, sort of they were applauding that. So an individual that means sort of an individual cannot necessarily bring a claim directly against a business. But from the Attorney General's standpoint, there's a pretty hefty fine there for a violation. I believe this amount is less than the amount in California, so that's a good thing. But still, $7,500 per violation is certainly nothing to balk at. So I know I ran through those last couple slides very quickly, but I did want to have an opportunity if anyone had questions, and also be mindful of the fact that you're all running businesses and that you have other things to do during your day.